Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. The speed at which this transformation is happening, we do need guardrails. We need to make sure that everything that happens in a way that's beneficial to everyone. With me today is somebody I've known from my verification days. It's Jason Oberg. Jason, tell us about your story. How did you end up becoming the person you are today? And what's Cycuity all about?
My background's in the hardware security space. We had been working at UC San Diego. My PhD advisor, Ryan Kastner, and a collaborator, Tim Sherwood at UC Santa Barbara. And one of my co-founders, Jonathan Valamehr, who also did his PhD at UC Santa Barbara. We'd all been working together in the hardware security space. It's one of those things where folks that have done a PhD and work in academics, you work on problems that are more intellectually interesting rather than there's a market for it. So it may be a hard scientific problem or it's a new area. So it's always unclear where things are going to actually go. As we were working in this space, we just saw there was a lot of industry interest, both in the commercial semiconductor market, but also in the defense within the US government. We officially incorporated around 2013 and really kicked off the company in 2014. I was still a graduate student when we legally incorporated. We actually got an SBIR, a small business research grant from the National Science Foundation in summer of 2014. I was a poor grad student at the time, so couldn't buy food unless I was employed. So the SBR was the first ability for us to actually get an office, start really working. And so my co-founder, Johnny, and I really started moving things forward. Fast forwarding a bit, we had some early angel investment, some great advisors that helped us out early on. About 2015 or so is when I met John East. He's the former CEO of Alcatel. He's been on our board since then. We had some early angel investment from some really believers in the technology in the company in around that time frame. And so we ended up getting an SBR phase 2. That was pretty exciting. From there, we raised some venture funding, started growing out the company, building out our products. The core thesis of everything we've been doing is really focused on hardware security, helping identify security vulnerabilities in chip designs and trying to build good solutions and products that can help.
In fact, in 2014, people believed you just run McAfee or Norton security software, you're good.
Yeah.
What got you interested in the first place in areas like security? And that to even more obscure hardware security, security at the chip or inside the chip level. How has it made a difference over these years?
Honestly, it's by accident. It's one of those things when you're doing research, especially in an academic setting, looking for greenfield areas that are unexplored, that have hard problems to solve, that are new. If you look at more system level security, a lot of active research in that domain, obviously. Where that intersected with hardware was really new. Now there's a lot of conferences on this topic, components of the chip for that related to the CHIPS Act. There's the ME Commons, which is funded through the DoD. Now there's components of that are focused on security. When we were doing research, I remember struggling to get papers accepted because people didn't understand what we were writing. I'd like to say we could see it coming, we were geniuses, but honestly, it's one of those things where the timing was good. We got a little lucky. We were working on some problems that ended up becoming a lot more important. Obviously, our goal is to really help design more secure systems, and hardware is often an afterthought. If you don't have secure hardware and you are booting up a system and someone could subvert that by going around all your software security protections, then your whole system get compromised anyway. So we're really a key thesis of focusing on there. There's a lot of work to be done there. It's a very new space. So
yeah, system level hacking has been going on forever. I still remember a teenager was able to bring down a big chunk of the internet. Do you any high profile cases when people were able to subvert and break the security through only hardware means and not just through application level software?
The most visible hardware vulnerabilities were what are often called transient execution vulnerabilities, or these microprocessor vulnerabilities, specifically like Meltdown, Spectre, and these types of variants. The really scary thing about these that brought a lot of visibility was that you didn't actually need physical access to be successful. Just to distill it down in its simplest form, modern processors have a lot of high performance features. They do speculation, they guess what instructions to execute. They do things out of order because it's more efficient. If you're doing a memory store operation, there's no reason to wait for the store to finish before you forward that to a load that needs it. When you start doing all these things in parallel, you can basically start forwarding and accessing stale data or data that it should not have been able to access because you can mispredict, you could forward data incorrectly. And a lot of these vulnerabilities really exploited those performance features and showed that you could actually extract secret data pretty easily. They're pretty sophisticated. The scary thing about them is they exploit such foundational features of our modern processors. There's been decades of research into making our processors run as fast as they do. The security vulnerabilities that have been discovered directly exploit a lot of those features. It's a challenge. There's a lot of work in this space. I participate on what's called the Common Weakness Enumeration, which is a MITRE-maintained initiative focused on identifying root cause weaknesses for vulnerabilities. We just had a big collaboration with Intel, AMD, ARM, Riskier to really classify the root cause of these weaknesses. This is actually getting announced on February 29th. That's probably the biggest profile. There's been a lot of others, whether it's been publicly disclosed or found internally by teams. But those are the ones that have hit a lot more of the mainstream media, for sure.
Let's say I'm a mid-sized or a small company, but not related to technology at all. But I use computers, everybody uses computers these days. I use, let's say, even farms to do e-commerce or oil exploration. Do I need to worry about hardware level security, or do only these chip makers, who are the ones who are responsible for making sure that their chips and their systems are secure?
That's a great question. It's important to always be aware and concerned. You, as the consumer of a smartphone or a laptop and what have you, you have very little control over what you're being provided. But that said, as a consumer, really understanding, I trust the hardware that's in my device. I trust the chipsets. I trust them to behave securely. Having that assurance, you feel confident that they're behaving securely, is important. Ultimately, the user is going to be impacted by this. Maybe leaking some of your personal information, stealing information, whatever. But at the same time, you'll be impacted from a performance usability standpoint, because if a mitigation is added or a fix is added, that might adversely impact the experience of using the product. The mitigation affects the normal process. We saw this with Meltdown Inspector. A lot of the mitigations that were first added really hurt performance, especially in cloud data center type of environments. It is important to be aware, so the consumer it's hard for them to go and turn on a hardware security feature or something like that. But it's important to be aware. There's a lot of things that are driving that awareness too. The CHIPS Act, where most of the funding is focused on onshore manufacturing, helping stimulate overall semiconductor innovation in the United States. There is components of that have brought a lot more awareness to just semiconductors in general, as well as to the importance of securing our supply chain and securing designs in general. All this is really good for awareness. Ultimately, the end user is going to be the one that's impacted.
I recall when we used to interact when at Synopsys, your company had a different name. How did you come up with the name Cycuity, and what does it mean?
When we first started the company, we used to be formerly known as Tortuga Logic. When you're early on, to form a company, you need a legal name to open a bank account, to run payroll. So there was very little marketing thought when we started our company. It was appropriate to really go through rebranding and think about what's the key benefit we're providing to our customers, what's the unique offering we have. Basically, where Cycuity comes from, it's a conjunction of both cybersecurity, where the Psi comes from, and then Acuity, which is basically insight and knowledge and finding unknown behavior. Combining those two together as Cycuity, because we provide unique insight into what's going on at the hardware level, what's going on in your chip design from a security perspective.
Pretty exciting. When I started following Cycuity, that was several months ago, there was no talk about the recent funding that you received from the government. Can you get into that a little bit? What was the reason for the award, and what can people expect will come out of the research and the development that you folks are doing?
Just to clarify, the initial funding we received from DoD was actually from what's called the Trusted and Assured Microelectronics Program, which is a program that's actually maintained by the Research and Engineering Group within the Office of Secretary of Defense, or within the DoD broader. There's obviously shared overlap because there's CHIPS funding coming through DoD for this program called the Microelectronics Commons. And all these things are interrelated at some level. We were awarded an IDIQ, which is an acronym that basically stands for indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. What it means is it's a flexible frame contract with a $99 million ceiling. It allows us to basically support any use of our software, so our Radix software, make enhancements to it, customize it, basically meet the DoD's needs. It's a very flexible contract. Somebody within the government wants to work with us. We have the whole infrastructure so that we could accept that funding through a contract and actually go through and start doing work. One of the biggest challenges that I've learned, the contract is almost always the hardest part. What you typically have to have happen is a big solicitation. You have a big RFP, request for proposals. You have to go through a big selection process and all these types of things. Because we had some SBIR, these small business innovation research grants, we were able to basically have that sole source selection for our contract. We didn't have to openly compete to get this established, and to receive additional funding, you have to obviously align with some of the broader program objectives, but we don't necessarily have to compete across these bigger programs because the funding would be specific to something that's already SBIR developed. That provides a lot of unique benefit that we can provide the government. It's flexible. It's very easy to interact with them. They always say it's the golden ticket as an early stage company to get alignment with the government, because it's really hard for a big organization to get the type of contract we have. It requires such a big, open, competed complex process. It's hard to find those opportunities. I feel fortunate we're able to get that sole source IDIQ over the next 7 years or so.
Congratulations to all
Thank
of
you.
you. I started following all the things you're doing before there was any of this news because I knew there was a lot of promise. I studied the semiconductor supply chain over the last few years, and it's extremely complex. It's totally global. When you get into the commercial applications like an autonomous car, it's almost impossible to have the entire supply chain completely local. What safeguards can you put in at the chip level or at the IP level to ensure that we have complete cybersecurity? Let's say that your car will not be taken over by somebody. How do you ensure that?
That's challenging. If you look at across the semiconductor design and development process, all the different stages from architectural planning all the way through mask sets, tape out, everything else at the back end, there's different threats that hit each of those different stages. From my perspective, the lowest hanging fruit from an adversary standpoint is at the design side, because at that point, it's just code. It's easy to insert a bug. It'd be easy to find a bug that the creator of the chip didn't know about. Whereas making some sort of change or modifying something in the mask set or in the foundry would be extremely challenging. If you look at it from an adversary standpoint, finding the easiest attack points is always the best strategy. Focusing on the design is really a key component of this. And that's where we focus a lot on. One thing you mentioned that's really important is that the whole notion of IP is really interesting. If you think about IP itself from a supply chain standpoint, has its own ecosystem. Modern SoCs are very much just IP stitched together in very unique ways. Obviously, organizations build custom blocks for certain use cases, but even in the government, they license a lot of IP from commercial parties. Why rebuild an Ethernet controller from scratch or a DDR? So a lot of that's licensed. Then who developed it? Where did it come from? Does it have any nefarious behavior in it? These types of things are really challenging. In our contract with DoD, we actually have a lot of focus on helping provide solutions and some new techniques for helping vet third-party IP that would go into both DoD as well as commercial applications. That is a huge challenge. Obviously, the supply chain concern is very broad. A lot of the chips focus is on the manufacturing side. We need that, obviously. Then we can actually have dedicated foundries. We can control a lot more of the manufacturing. On the design side, it's equally as important to prevent vulnerabilities. If you manufacture onshore, but you're using IP of another country or maybe open source or something you don't understand, and that gets manufactured in the United States, you can still exploit it, whether it was manufactured onshore or manufactured offshore. That's a key thing that we're really focused on. To me, it is a really low-hanging fruit from an attacker standpoint.
So, Jason, it's possible that we'll start getting chiplets from multiple vendors. Under these scenarios, what can Cycuity do to ensure that the entire chip itself will be secure? Although the chiplets and the IP come with all these heterogeneous architectures with different processes, different speeds, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Most of our focus is on the design side. In the presence of chiplets, it's related to the third-party IP concerns. If you're building everything in a single package and you have obviously the RTL for different IP and you build a chip, you want to have assurance that the IP itself is behaving securely and it's been integrated securely. From a chiplet perspective, there's a lot of interesting dynamics where if you're going to be using a chiplet from a third party, you want to have some assurance that it's behaving securely. We're a huge advocate of defining security requirements for the chiplet and then being transparent about what was verified so that the consumer can understand what was verified, what was not. The key thing is really a lot of transparency around ownership from security. To make this work effectively, the chiplet providers can say, here's what I verified, here's what I own, here's what you're going to have to configure, and here's what you're going to have to own, consumer of the chiplet that's actually building the final silicon. Having that handoff and that transparency is really going to be key to this, because ultimately security itself is not composable, meaning like you can't verify component A and component B is secure and then connect them and assume it's secure. This doesn't work like that. Reality is with chiplets, everything is very fragmented. You're going to just get all this stuff and connect it up. It's really important that there's transparency shared from the creators of the chiplet to the consumer of it so that it can be really well understood what was analyzed from a security perspective and what wasn't, so that the user can actually fill in those gaps. Otherwise, it's just sticking together a bunch of black boxes. From a security perspective, that's really scary. So
you bring up something very interesting. When we have little components and they're very complex, and then you build a much more complex system, there's always emergence. There are many more things that can happen that were not envisioned when the individual chiplets or the individual IP blocks are put together. Likewise, the complexity can result in cybersecurity issues which are emergent, which were never conceived at the time of building these little IP
100%.
blocks. How do you even capture those kinds of emergent security issues?
100%. Our security issues are hidden in complexity. As your complexity goes up, so does your vulnerabilities. It's challenging, man. For companies that are vertically integrated, you can re-verify and build this up. You can be a lot more effective. So if you control your IP, your chips, your software, and you're very vertically integrated organizations, you can be a lot more effective. It becomes very challenging when it's very fragmented. And so honestly, the best you can do is have a lot of good assurance from the provider of the component, in this case, a chiplet. I verified this, have confidence these requirements are met. We did not look at this other set of requirements, so that the user of it can actually backfill those gaps and then understand how this relates. Otherwise, if there's not a lot of transparency there, when it all comes together, there might be this huge issue that you actually can't fix. That's the scariest part about all this. It's a challenge. I would want to say we have a solution to it, but it requires just a different mindset. It has to be started at the component level. You have to think about every piece of this and build out your whole security program.
Yeah, you can't build a foundation after the house is built. Does this mean that vertically integrated companies are much more likely to be able to deal with security? What about all the RISC-V movement and all these open source IP? Is there a way to make them really secure?
Yeah, so on the first one, vertically integrated companies are better set up to be more secure. It all goes back to you have to have a good security program, good methodologies of defining requirements, re-verifying them. Inherently, they control most of their supply chain from IP, chip, SoC design software, all the way up to the application software, even in some cases. That just makes it a lot easier because they can revalidate across the whole supply chain. They need a security process. Just them being vertically integrated doesn't mean they're more secure, right? A company that's fragmented but has a good process can be more secure. It's going to be easier to do. On your second question about open source, there's a couple camps. There's a camp that thinks open source software is more secure because more people can look at it. And there's another camp that thinks it's less secure. So there's business incentive to make it secure. If you're looking at a commercial organization that's building something in-house, they have financial and business incentives to make sure that that isn't hacked and that they're not sued and they don't lose customers. If it's just sitting out there in open source space, there's a collective goal, more goodwill of people trying to come together to make sure it behaves securely, but there's no business incentive to do it. Just the fact that it's open source doesn't make it secure. The interesting thing about RISC-V is that because it's open, it makes it easy for organizations that do have business incentives to build things, and then they can control more of that. So when I went back to the vertically integrated side, if you have access to the RTL, you have access to the software, you can now analyze all that. Whereas if you license the processor IP and you don't know what's inside of it, then you're not able to analyze that. And then it goes back to what I mentioned about things being more fragmented. So there is a benefit in that space, but just because it's open source, I wouldn't say it's more secure.
In other words, somebody who buys these source level code can actually control, if they choose to, develop a vertically integrated solution from there.
Exactly. And that can help you be more secure.
It's one of those things where at the end of the day, the buck stops where you're selling the end product. It's full responsibility on their part to make sure that no matter whether it's proprietary or open source, they have to take full responsibility for it.
Yep, exactly.
One of the interesting things is years ago, everybody had to have a PhD. How can people get into this field? And what are the opportunities for them today?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. We're at a unique intersection. Our team members have a lot of really good semiconductor background primarily. They learn security as they go. Finding someone that knows hardware and security at the same time, unless you go to very specific groups with companies, they're pretty hard to find. There's a lot of research being done in that space, so you can hire somebody with a PhD that understands this. To be like a deep cryptography expert, or I would say really deep in some of the theory, you need to have a certain expertise. You can learn some of the security practices pretty easily. To learn about hardware security, being a really good hardware practitioner, understanding your background's all in verification, picking up security isn't as hard as picking up the hardware side of it. As an industry, know how to educate on verification, semiconductor design. Learning some of the basic security concepts on top of that is definitely achievable. You don't need a PhD for this. Going the other way I found is a little more challenging. If you have a pure security background, going and trying to learning all the hardware, it tends to be a little bit harder. It's easier to learn some of the basic security concepts onto the core semiconductor hardware foundation.
That's good to know. There's a lot of concern that when you have quantum chips coming and quantum computing, they could burn the existing security methods, including PGP encryption and a whole bunch of other things.
Yep.
Are you guys getting ready for that, or is that still premature?
And that's a good question. We're very much focused on preventing vulnerabilities. So we detect design weaknesses that an adversary may exploit. When it comes to quantum crypto in general, what we're going to see, and we're already seeing, is implementations of these quantum resistant crypto algorithms in actual hardware. Implementations of those still have to be validated and analyzed from a security perspective. The same issues that we see with a more conventional or existing cryptography, like how you manage your key material. Do you properly clear it? Do you have debug modes turned on? These types of things don't go away with the use of post-quantum crypto. Some of the implementation issues that exist today are still going to exist when we use post-quantum crypto. I definitely agree that we see a movement towards that with our customers. They're starting to use more post-quantum crypto. They're starting to add more of those primitives, especially companies that have chipsets that are in the field for many, many years. Depending on the market, if it's an IoT market, things turn a lot quicker than something in a defense application, which sits in the field for 15 plus years. For the ones that are in the field for very long, we have to make sure that we're adding those new capabilities so that once quantum computers are mainstream, that the crypto we have out there in the field is ready for it. But like I said, the implementation issues that we face today are not going away just because we're using post-quantum crypto.
You remind me of my graduate school days. Everything I did became some product or the other, whether it was in Xilinx or in Patriot missiles. One of the challenges I faced was that I was so obsessed with the technology, I would not sleep, work day and night, the excitement of it. And it took me a while to realize that it is a good idea to have work-life balance. Did you find yourself doing that?
The unfortunate reality of a small company is you just have to accept that you can't have it. For me, it's been almost 10 years now. It's still a lot of work now. We've come a long way. When you're very, very early every day, you're worried that you're going to run out of money. It's a different dynamic. You're fighting for your life. We're obviously very motivated and driven, and we're growing and everybody's working really hard. It's not like we're going to go bankrupt. The company's doing well. We're growing. It's different. I have probably more work-life balance than I did several years ago. The unfortunate reality when you start a company is that's just goes out the window and you have to accept that.
Jason, it's really great talking to you. All power to you guys and to people who are listening. This is why I talk to many people. As much as we want this crypto, we want all these things, there's also need for guardrails. There's a need for safety. Machines don't yet build machines, so we need humans like Jason who can think through and say, what are the abilities? What are the ways things can be exploited? So thank you for that. And to people who are listening, would love to hear your stories. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities so that we can create a safer, better world for everyone? Thanks again, Jason, and I look forward to meeting you. It's been a while.
Thanks so much. This is great.